Thank you, John. Thank you, John. Hello, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Elaine Pardick, and I am your account representative for Frog Street. Welcome to our virtual lunch and learn this afternoon. Also joining us this afternoon is Kelly Philbin, Vice President of Sales for Frog Street. Hopefully everyone received their lunch cards either by mail or email this week for today's event. Also, special thank you to John Mountjoy for his help in organizing today's luncheon. For those of you who are not familiar with Frog Street is a publisher focused on early childhood education, offering research-based curriculum for children from birth through pre-kindergarten, and offering best-in-class professional learning for teachers, administrators, and coaches. Your presenter this afternoon is Tracey Roden. Her session will be on the importance of intentionality in the early childhood classroom. Tracey is the Director of Research and Assessment at Frog Street. Tracey has extensive knowledge and diverse experience in early childhood education and leadership. It is my pleasure this afternoon to welcome Tracey Roden. Hi, Tracey.
Hi, Elaine. Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here. I just thank you for taking your time out to come and listen to us talk about the importance of intentionality in classroom, in the early childhood classroom. I know your days are busy and full of all sorts of activities just in your role. So we really appreciate your time that you are taking to come listen to us and share with us. So a little bit about me. I am a former center director. I was a child care center director for several years, a former early childhood educator. I was a pre-K teacher, a kindergarten teacher, and an instructional coach. And then the last 16 years, I've spent in educational technology and publishing. I'm a doc student, so I'm working on my doctorate in curriculum and instruction. And ultimately, I'm a wife and a mom of 3 children, as you can see in these pictures here. So I come from a background of early childhood. I come from a background of, I've walked in your shoes. And so I know what your days are like. And so I hope as I share today that you can see my genuine love for the field, and also me just wanting to share, my knowledge and experience to impart to you today. So today we're going to talk about intentionality. And I know in the world of early childhood, we hear a lot about that. And I'm going to try to break it down into practical uses and what it really means to be intentional in our day-to-day world of early childhood and what it means for our teachers. I always start my presentations out with a quote, and one of these is, if you're going to grow, you have to be intentional. And as adults, we do that a lot. And particularly in this day and age, we write down goals and we're very intentional about what we want to do and how we want to do it, and maybe when we want to do it. It could be a variety of things. We want to make a goal to get an exercise routine, or we want to make a goal to get out of debt. We make different goals for ourselves consistently. We have to do the same thing for children. We have to be very focused on where we want to take them as they go through our programs, and we have to be intentional about that. So they're going to naturally grow and develop. Children are going to naturally get taller. They're going to naturally develop language. There's lots of things that just for the sake of being a human are going to happen. But for that growth for them to grow in specific things in order to be school ready and to enter kindergarten, we have to be very intentional about that. And that is going to be the focus of our time today. So if you were planning a trip to Disney, think about the things that you would do. Honestly, I have never planned a trip for Disney for my family, but if I was going to plan a trip for Disney, I think I would be very intentional about that. I would need to come up with travel arrangements. Am I driving? Am I flying? Or maybe I live close. So is it a day trip or is it a week-long trip? I need my housing taken care of. So where am I staying? Am I staying in the parks or off the parks? And now I understand with Disney, you need to have, certain day passes and fast passes and all those different things. You even have to plan and get reservations for meals if you're going to eat at restaurants in the park. So I would have to be very intentional in how I am planning that trip, as compared to if I wanted to plan a trip to the park. So if I decided that my children come home after school and we're going to the park, that would be, maybe I need to pack some bottles of water, or maybe we need to take a blanket. I know I have one child that's going to want to take a football or a soccer ball, and we're going to jump in the car and go. So there's a very different process for planning these trips compared to planning a trip to Disney or planning a trip to the park. I'm going to be very intentional in what I do when I'm planning a vacation trip to Disney, but my trip to the park, I'm going to be able to shoot from the hip and, okay, let me grab this bottle of water, grab my keys. Maybe we're walking, maybe get the leash and the dog, and we're going to the park. So very different ways of planning. When we are looking at our classrooms, we have to be intentional. So what does that mean? We know we have to think specifically about it, but what does that mean for a classroom? It means to be deliberate and purposeful. So to look at what we need to do and plan accordingly. So very deliberate and purposeful. That goes for outside the classroom, but also in the classroom as well. The goal of an intentional teacher is to ensure that children acquire the knowledge and skills they need for school and life. So that means for an intentional teacher is to look at where we need them to go. Look at what maybe our standards say, or our, what the E-Law framework says, where we need them to go. Where do we need to take them as they leave us? What do they need in school and in life, and plan accordingly that way. So very, again, intentional and purposeful. So currently, we, as early childhood educators, we have to make every minute count. Most of our programs exist because we are working with children who are already at risk. We need children who are at risk, in their development of language, maybe because of their socioeconomic status. There's many reasons why they're at risk. So our programs exist because we want to catch children up. They're coming to us already behind. So we have to make every minute count to have them prepared for kindergarten or school entry. Even now, coming out of a pandemic or still working through a pandemic, that is even more true, that every minute must count. Many of our children that we are, that are in our classrooms, most of their life has been in a pandemic time. So where they haven't had as many interactions, they haven't had as many opportunities to interact with adults or other children, to build those social emotional skills, all those different things that happen in our classroom. So they're already coming to us at risk during normal times. And then just for the sake of being separated from others because of pandemic, it just makes that more important. So we have to make every minute count. We must ensure that they leave their preschool years with a foundation they need to succeed in kindergarten. And, the early learning outcomes framework sets that up for us. So it says these are the things they need to be successful in kindergarten. But even more so now, we have to pay attention to what that says because they're coming to us with less experiences and interactions with people around them. So we have to be very intentional in our teaching. We need to be focused on that framework and make sure we are incorporating that in what we do every day. Research shows us that effective teachers are intentional in their planning and implementations of activities and lessons for children. They're not shooting from the hip. They're not going in there day to day and say, okay, what are we going to do today? They have planned it, and that allows them the time to be able to meet individual needs of children. So research shows effective teachers are the ones who are planning, looking at what their framework says, and being intentional in making sure that how that is implemented. So what does it look like in a classroom? What does intentionality look like in a classroom? We know what it looks like when we're planning a trip to Disney. We know what it looks like in our life when we're setting goals, but what does it look like for it teaching? What does intentional teaching look like? It does not happen by chance. High quality teachers can have a very effective learning environment when they sit down, spontaneously with children, but that is not true for all teachers. It does not happen by chance. It is purposeful, well-planned, and fun. And teachers use their knowledge and their judgment and their expertise to organize learning environments for children. Judgment is such a big part of this. You have knowledge and expertise if you have been a teacher, but also your judgment of what works and what doesn't work is really important when you go into intentional teaching. So in the classroom, intentional teaching is a teacher can articulate a purpose for each activity. And what that means is if a visitor walked in or a potential family walks in and they look at a classroom and children are working in learning centers and they're engaged, a teacher can articulate the purpose for those activities. It's not just, oh, they're in pretend and learn and they're having fun. A teacher can say they're in a pretend and learn center and we're working on our oral language development and they're working on the vocabulary that we have covered this week. You can articulate a purpose for that activity. You have a plan for what specific learning activities children will engage in. So it's not, oh, okay, they're just going to go to these areas and they're going to play. Well, of course they're going to go to those areas and play, but what are they working on? What goals are we working towards when they're in those activities? You have a plan which learning contexts and settings to use. So for example, you know that there's going to be some activities that you might do outside because the weather is starting to get nice. Or there may be some activities that you use for small group and some that you use for whole group and some that will go into your learning centers. You determine how much time you're going to spend in activity. That is all very intentional. So it's not, okay, well, we'll see how it goes and we'll transition to the next activity when they're ready. No, you know how much time is going to be spent in each of these activities. And then ultimately you have integration for optimal learning. And this naturally happens in early childhood classrooms where, you know, we use our literature, our story times, our read alouds to integrate math and science and social studies, but you integrate these things together to really have the most optimal learning. So intentionality gets a bad rap. Many people think when you use the word intentionality, it means structure. So if you look at my balance scale, everybody thinks intentionality is all about that schedule, all about a script, all about structure. It's not. It's a balance of that structure with free choice. Intentionality still gives children choice, but you have planned when that's going to happen. You have planned how, you know, when are we going to be able to allow children free choice? And then what are we going to gather out of that free choice to inform our next steps when we're planning additional activities? You know, Dr. Epstein is really a huge focus of her research is intentionality. And she says the intentional teacher applies best practices in a balanced offering of child-guided and adult-guided experiences. So intentionality is not just about structure, all adult-guided experiences. It's also about child-guided experiences, but that adult is learning from those child-guided experiences in order to plan, which is being intentional, for the experiences that are going to happen in the future. So it is a balance. It's not just structure over free choice. It's a true balance of both of them. So as teachers, we know we provide materials for children to manipulate, explore, and play with each day. That is one of our roles as educators, is to provide those materials. We also know that children need a wide variety of experiences to experience with each day. So we know we have materials in our classroom and we must provide them for them to, you know, to investigate, explore, and play. And we know they need a variety of those. Those are common things that we're very aware of as early childhood educators. But with intentionality, we apply another level to that. So we note the way children use those materials. So we provide them to them, but we're noticing and making note of what they're doing with them. We notice their developmental stage. So if we're in, you know, a construction center or a block center, we're noticing that some children might be lining blocks across the floor and some children might be stacking the blocks as high as they can go before they tumble. We're noticing the difference in the different developmental stages of children. We know that maybe in pretend and learn that some children are just talking and they're using invented spelling to make lists, and they're, you know, in charge of their family if they're pretending to be a family. And we may notice other children are in pretend and learn, but they're kind of playing on their own and not engaging with others. So we're noticing their developmental stage of what they're doing. And then we plan those, our next activities to help move children to that next stage. So we plan, how are we going to help children who are more advanced in their developmental stage? And how are we going to bring children who need some support to bring them up to the next stage? And then ultimately, we provide additional materials to help children, guide children to move them to use those materials in a new way. And I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. So we always provide them materials, but now how do we provide additional materials to help look at what they already have in a different way? So let me give you some examples of that. So if we have, many of us have investigation type science centers or areas in our classrooms or in our centers. We put shells and leaves and different objects in those. We may even have, classroom pets or different animals in those centers. And we want children to observe them and notice differences and similarities. One way that we can add a material to that, so we have shells and we want children to look at them and talk about what they see, we can add a magnifying glass. So we add an additional material so they can see it more closely. Or we can add zoomed in photographs of these different objects such as shells so they can see the patterns and the colors and the textures at a magnifying view versus just kind of looking at them and sorting them. So we already have the materials of the different objects they can investigate, but we add another material such as a magnifying glass or photographs that are zoomed in of those materials. That is intentionality, so they can see it closely and talk about it with a little bit more detail. So blocks, we are a construction center. This is something that I experienced as a pre-K teacher, often in a kindergarten teacher. I had children who loved a certain activity or a certain center, and that's where they wanted to go, and I'm giving them choice, so they go there. So I had a hard time maybe getting them to go to the writing center or go to, the library center to look at books and do those different things. They loved the construction center. So I needed to develop their writing. So in order to let them have that choice and let them do something that they loved, I put writing materials in the construction center and maybe encourage them to label what they were going to do. I would often see them label things zoo or label things farm, and they would write on or draw pictures on index cards. This is an example of that. So this is an actual teacher who is trying to do the same thing, to get a child who was more interested in construction and building things, but build their language and literacy skills. And so she put in index cards for them to label things. And this is an example. They labeled gym and they drew hearts because the gym is where you go to keep your heart healthy. And there's other different labeling systems there. So they're very intentional in letting them have their free choice, but here, let me put materials in the center that promote other skills so that they can continue to grow and develop in other domains. Another one is the art center. We all have art centers. We have children who paint on easels. We do all sorts of things when it comes to this. But this is a wonderful time to talk about safety as well. So, we are very careful not to drip paint on the floor. If we do, we clean it up to keep us safe so we don't slip and fall. Same thing with other materials, that we pick them up from the floor so that children don't slip and fall. So you can take a center such as art, use intentionality where it's not specifically a material, but you're using language of safety to make sure that they are also practicing those skills as well. So these are examples of how we take materials that are already in our classroom, but we apply other materials to them in an intentional way to have children grow and develop in other domains or the domain that they're working in. So you have to consciously plan activities and be very deliberate and specific and have specific objectives in mind. And again, you will continue to hear me talk about the early learning outcomes framework for Head Start. It does that for us. There are specific objectives there. And so when we're planning our activities, we need to keep those objectives in mind, because that will ensure that children are working towards school readiness. It will help you meet the needs of children. It will help them learn and grow as they should. And purposeful planning leaves more time for fun. And I know some people don't believe me when I say that, But when you're purposeful and you're making sure that those objectives are being met in what you have planned with your activities, it does leave you more time for fun because you know you're meeting those objectives. And so you can maybe stay in an activity a little bit longer because you guys are having fun with it, because you know what's being addressed and what's not being addressed. So best practice is for intentional instruction. So we're going to go through these the rest of the time, some best practices to make sure intentionality is happening in your classroom. The first one is shaping the physical environment, of how you set up your physical environment to help you with intentional instruction, planning and creating intentional activities and experiences, interacting with children, building relationships with families, and monitoring children's progress as they engage in intentional activities. So we're going to spend the rest of this time talking about these 5 best practices and how if you implement these best practices, it will build an environment for intentionality in the early childhood classroom. So first, in shaping the physical environment, this looks different based on the age group that you have. You want to provide safe and healthy indoor and outdoor spaces. So if you have an infant room, that's going to look very different than your pre-K room will look. An infant room, you want to make sure you keep all the things away from them that they could chew on or choke on. But in a pre-K room, you are probably adding more and more materials for them to investigate and experience. You also want to make sure your outdoor spaces are safe. And that, again, that's going to look different based on the age range, so that they can have a healthy outdoor place. This can mean a variety of things that provides them areas to run and jump and move and work on those gross motor activities, but it also provides them areas where they can sit down and interact with their friends that are safe as well. You want to organize the space and areas of interest or centers. And this even goes all the way down to infants and tots. You want to organize your space so that every space has a purpose, and children, even at a very young age, learn the purposes for each space. This is to promote organization and structure. Children thrive in organization and structure. And when we don't have certain spaces for certain things, it can sometimes provide chaos, and children do not thrive in that as much as if the space is organized in areas, interest, and or centers. And then we want to make sure we supply a variety of diverse equipment and materials. We have a lot of materials in our early childhood classrooms, but sometimes we need to mix it up and have diversity. And that goes back to the slide where I was talking about adding materials to promote learning in other domains. You can bring in writing materials into your construction center. You can bring in construction materials into Pretend and Learn. In your maybe music and movement area, you can bring all sorts of things in. So making sure that there's a variety, but also a diverse supply of materials. And then it's very, very important to display work and projects created by children. And we're going to talk a lot about this, a little bit more about this when we talk about interacting with children and monitoring their progress. But children need to see their work displayed. And whether that is a drawing or a scribble or an art activity that you did together, they need to display it. And the reason it needs to be displayed because it gives it importance to a child, and it gives them opportunities to talk about their work and opportunities for you to peer into their thinking and get them to talk about their work so you understand what they were thinking when they did that different activity. Also for families to be able to view their work, and it's not all going to be the same. You don't have to put the same work sample for every child. It could be different things like you see in this photograph here. These are obviously very different activities and different projects created by children that are displayed for others to see, but also for them to see. It gives value to what they're doing in the classroom. The second best practice is planning and creating intentional activities and experiences. And we've already talked a lot about this, about really looking at what you're going to plan for children to do. So you really truly need to consider the specific objectives that must be accomplished by the end of the year. So looking to your framework, looking at the ELI framework, and see what is expected of them before they leave you. It is very important. And when you look at what is expected at the end, it helps you determine how you need to plan that out. So if you really, really need children to be able to make growth and fill those gaps, if that is what is happening based on how they come to you, you have to look at the end. What do I need them to do by the time they leave me? Intentional teaching is planning across the whole day, not just a portion of the day. So looking at the whole day, but I like to take this a step further. It is planning across the whole year, not just one day or 1 week. You're looking at everything as a whole so you can make sure you're meeting those objectives. Also introducing concepts. So understanding that when you introduce something new, it needs to be in a whole group setting or a small group setting. You don't want to introduce new concepts or new skills in centers when they're practicing on their own. You know, if we're talking about new shapes or, new concepts in, science concepts or social studies concepts, that needs to be done in a whole or small group setting. So where you're actually introducing it and teaching it. Children are not always, some children will acquire that on their own, but others need it to be introduced to them in a whole or small group. And then you provide them time to practice it and establish those skills in centers. So if you're working on grasping a writing instrument, whether that's in a toddler age or a preschool age, you introduce that to them when you're working with them, maybe in a small group or individually, but then you allow them time to practice that in centers and establish that writing grip and being able to draw straight lines and curve lines. So you don't necessarily just let them figure that out on their own in a practice center. Introduce it and then give them plenty of time to practice it. That is being intentional in the classroom. You also want to mix up your child-directed and guided play activities to be incorporated during the day. So you want to make sure that you have time for them to direct what they're doing, but also guided play opportunities. And many people say, well, Tracey, what is guided play? Guided play is a child-directed nature of free play, but with a focus on learning outcomes and adult scaffolding. So you're letting them direct the play, but an adult is also there guiding them or interacting with them to be able to guide them to meet those different learning objectives. So if they're in a center and you see that they're sorting objects, you can guide them and ask them, okay, so tell me about what you're doing here. How are you sorting these? Tell me about what your rules are and talk about that. And that extends that learning towards a learning objective or outcome, not just, you're playing. So it's a guided nature of play. Children are guiding it, but a teacher is there scaffolding and leading them towards that learning objective. So number 3, the third best practice is interacting with children. And so that guided play leads us to interacting with children. It is so important to interact with children on a daily basis. This is how we get to know them. This is how we get to learn and know more about their progress as they're developing. But in order to interact with children, we have to create a warm and caring atmosphere, a warm and caring environment. They need to know that they're safe and they're loved, and they are going to interact with you if they feel that. So before interaction, we have to create that warm and caring atmosphere. And then we introduce concepts and model skills as we're interacting with them. So, we show them different things. So we introduce those skills in our small group and whole group instruction, and we model those skills as we're interacting with them, whether that is something as simple as using listening ears or eye contact or, simple things as how we use different materials. We model that as adults within our interactions. Our interactions are more than just do this, don't do that. More than just keeping them safe. They are showing them how we interact in environment, how we talk with others, and building those interaction skills. We support their oral language development, and we encourage developmentally appropriate communication. So we support them building that oral language, drawing that oral language out them, but also encouraging developmentally appropriate communication. So some of that may be nodding, and that may be like visual type communication. Some of it may be oral communication, but it's also communication with each other, kind words, and encouraging each other, knowing not when to interrupt and when not to interrupt, when to ask questions, when not to ask questions. So really showing that by a lot of modeling when you're interacting with children. And then encouraging independent problem solving and acknowledging their accomplishments. So when you're interacting with children, you can encourage them to solve problems. If they're having a difficulty with, whether it's a difficulty with a peer or difficulty with an activity, you can, and when you interact with them, you can encourage them to help solve that problem on their own and help them solve that problem. So when they encounter that again, they know what to do. But you also truly can acknowledge their accomplishments when they are doing that, showing them how they have grown and developed, and giving them, praise and feedback when they are with their different accomplishments. That goes back to displaying their work. When you put something up on the wall, it shows that you, as their teacher, are proud of what they've done, and what they have done is important. It's the same way with interacting with them. When you talk about, I like the way you did this, or you did such a great job on that, or I really appreciate the way you helped out your friend, that acknowledges their accomplishments, and they are going to do it again and again because they know that they are going to get praise and acknowledgement for that. So the fourth best practice is building relationships with families. And so when you're interacting with children, we need to interact with our families. We need to make sure we're building those relationships. We want to provide them information about the curriculum and how it promotes their child's development. We want them to know about, our objectives and goals. So what curriculum are you using? What does it do? And how is it going to meet these goals that we need to meet before a child leaves your room? We want to provide family engagement activities that extend learning in the home. We want to give them activities that allow them to understand what is happening in the classroom, but also the importance of that. Some families don't realize how important it is just to read a story to your child, that just a simple 20 minutes a day is putting them far, far ahead of children that are not read to at home. Or, simple songs and games that we do in classroom can be done in the home, and is extending that learning within the home. And number 5 is monitoring progress as they engage in intentional activities. So this kind of everything we do leads up to monitoring their progress. So, developing that physical environment, the intentional planning of the activities, the interaction with them, building those relationships with families allows us to monitor progress and see how children are doing. That monitoring of progress informs everything else we do in these best practices. So how do we monitor progress? This is so much more than just checklists and assessments. That is a part of it, but we monitor their progress by seeking evidence of their learning through observations and work samples and conversations, talking to children, interacting with them, getting into their little heads and understanding what they're thinking. We want to ask ourselves, what do I expect in their growth? What should I expect to see? And if I'm not seeing that, is my instruction effective? So if I'm expecting them to acquire knowledge of letters and sounds throughout the course of the year, and I have groups of children who are not, do I need to look back to my instruction? And what I'm doing, is that effective or is it not effective? Or if I have particular children that are struggling in different areas, what can I do with their instruction to make it more effective? So I need to seek evidence through observations and conversations, and of course work samples, but not just checklists, like watching and observing. I always say it, being a kid watcher. Watch children and see how they're growing, developing, and really interact with them so that you can hear them thinking about what they're doing. They can verbalize their thinking to you, and you understand how they're growing and developing. You want to reflect by asking them open-ended questions. So not just, okay, I like the way you drew that picture, but at more of, tell me about the picture you were drawing. tell me about what's in your picture. Tell me the story. And you can, those open-ended questions allows them to fill in the blanks for you versus just, you know, yes or no questions or simple direct answers. Ask them open-ended questions. So tell me about, you know, what you guys are doing in Pretend and Learn. Tell me about what you're pretending. Getting them to verbalize what they're doing allows you to monitor their progress. And if they can't verbalize it, that is actually giving you an awareness of, we need to work on oral language. We need to work on helping them have the vocabulary and the words to be able to talk about what they're doing. We do want to conduct skill-specific evaluations. Like I said, it's not all about checklists, but the checklists are important. You know, things like letters and sound identification, emotion, shapes, colors, you know, numbers, rote counting, all those different things. Those are important in monitoring progress, but it's not all very skill-specific. It also is kid watching and understanding how they interact with their environment, the learning experiences, and their peers. So when we intentionally plan, we are monitoring their progress as we plan, and we are interacting and building those relationships. This is a cyclical cycle. So it's not just one thing separate from the other. Those interactions and relationships inform our planning, and our planning informs how we monitor their progress, and the monitoring progress goes back and informs our planning. So all of these best practices are cyclical in nature. It's not separate of each other. They are helping you provide that intentionality in the classroom, knowing where your children are, knowing where you need to take them, and planning accordingly in between. And so that is the end of my presentation. I think I went through that a little bit quickly, a little bit more quickly than I expected, but this gives us an opportunity for questions or conversation. If you want to know more about Frog Street and Frog Street's way that we incorporate intentionality into our projects, you would reach out to Elaine, and here is her contact information here. So